The cake was being cut when my sister called me a failure. Vivian's birthday dinner had started pleasantly. Champagne glasses caught the light. Everyone was laughing, and I had finally relaxed. My sister was surrounded by compliments, where she was most comfortable. Then Aunt Carol asked what was new with my bookkeeping business. Before I could answer, Vivian laughed. Elise has always been good at making small things feel important. A few people smiled. Nobody said anything. I felt my fingers tighten around my napkin. Vivian looked at me. You know what your problem is, Elise? You were always afraid to become anything. That's why you're still a failure. The room went quiet. For a second, I couldn't move. That word landed harder than I expected. I'd heard versions of it for years. But I didn't argue. I reached into my purse and pulled out a cream envelope. Vivian's face changed the instant she saw it. She knew exactly what it was. She had been waiting for that envelope. I placed it in front of her and kept my voice low. You should probably open it before you say anything else. She stared at me. I didn't explain.
Not yet.
My name is Elise Marlowe. I'm 39, and my sister Vivian is 4 years older than me. Growing up, it never took long for anyone to notice the difference between us. Vivian seemed to know exactly what she wanted. She went to college, built an impressive career, dressed with the kind of confidence that made people look twice, and somehow always knew what to say when adults were listening. At family gatherings, people would ask about her work and lean forward as though every answer mattered. Vivian is really going places, my mother used to say, usually with a smile that made it clear she was proud. I was quieter. I liked things that were practical and predictable. When Mom started having trouble keeping up with household bills, I took over the paperwork. When she had appointments, I drove her. When something needed to be organized, I was usually the one who handled it without being asked. And whenever Vivian was busy with work, I filled in the gaps. I never thought much about it. That's just what I did. Nobody applauded those things. Vivian's promotions came with dinners and champagne. My bookkeeping business earned polite smiles and questions about whether I planned to do something bigger someday. The strange part was I never considered myself a failure. I had wanted more once, but I chose stability when Mom needed me, and eventually built a life that suited me. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Still, when people repeat something often enough, you start wondering if they see something you don't. After Mom died, I thought losing her would be the hardest thing we'd ever have to survive together. I was wrong. After Mom died, the house became the one thing Vivian talked about more than anything else. It was a modest 2-story place on a quiet street, the same house where we had grown up, argued over bathrooms, celebrated birthdays, and watched Mom turn every room into something that felt like home. I couldn't imagine thinking about it as an asset so soon after losing her. Vivian could. She started talking about the property almost casually, as though the decision had already been made. Honestly, it makes the most sense for me to have it, she told me one afternoon. I have a career. I can actually maintain the place. I remember looking at her and wondering when she had decided that those things gave her the right to choose. I didn't argue. I was still grieving, and the last thing I wanted was another fight. A few weeks later, Vivian called me while I was working. Did you get the paperwork from the lawyer yet? I stopped typing. What paperwork? The estate documents, she said, sounding almost surprised. They're being finalized. There was something about her tone that bothered me. She sounded less like someone asking a question, and more like someone checking whether I had received something she expected to see. The strange part was that I already had received correspondence from the lawyer. Vivian didn't know that. I also noticed something else. She asked about the house constantly, but barely mentioned Mom's jewelry, photographs, recipes, or the things we'd grown up with. It wasn't grief she seemed focused on.
It was ownership.
That was when I first understood that this wasn't simply about money. And that's when I made the mistake I'd been making my entire life. I decided it was easier not to argue with her again. A few weeks before Vivian's birthday, we had dinner at my aunt's house. I remember the conversation turning to Mom's old house because Vivian started talking about renovations. She had already decided which rooms she would change, what she would tear out, and whether it would be better to sell it after fixing it up. I waited until she finished. Have you talked to the estate lawyer? Vivian looked at me. About what? The house. She sighed. Elise, why do you always have to make everything complicated? I didn't answer. I was beginning to understand that, in Vivian's mind, asking questions was the same thing as creating problems. She picked up her glass and said, almost casually, Mom always knew I was the responsible one. She wanted me to have the house. I stared at her. She never told me that. Vivian shrugged. Maybe she didn't think you needed to know yet. There was something in the way she said it that made my stomach tighten. Then she added, Mom knew you weren't exactly in a position to handle something like that. I looked around the table. Nobody corrected her. Nobody even seemed surprised. That hurt more than I wanted to admit. Later, Vivian pulled a document from her bag and slid it toward me. Just sign this. It's basically acknowledging my claim, so we can get everything settled. I picked it up, but didn't sign. Her expression changed. You're jealous. No, I said quietly. I just want to read it first. She laughed under her breath. Of course you do. The conversation ended soon after that, but I took the document home with me. I told myself I was only being careful. Sitting at my kitchen table that night, I read it again, more slowly this time. Then I stopped. One of the figures connected to the property wasn't the number Vivian had described to me. I checked it again. It wasn't a typo. For the first time, I wondered whether Vivian had misunderstood the estate, or whether she had been telling me only the version she wanted me to believe. I pulled out Mom's papers and placed them beside the document. Suddenly, this felt less like a family disagreement and more like something I needed to understand. I could have confronted her that night. Instead, I did what I had always done. I went home and checked the numbers. I think I stayed quiet for so long because I learned early that keeping the peace was easier than asking to be treated fairly. When Vivian got angry as children, everyone noticed. If I was upset, I was usually told to let it go. Mom would pull me aside and say, "Can't you just let your sister have this one?" It wasn't that I was afraid of Vivian. I was afraid of what happened whenever I challenged her. She could turn one disagreement into a family argument, and somehow I always ended up feeling like I had caused it. So I became the easy daughter. I learned to swallow disappointment, change the subject, and tell myself that some things weren't worth fighting over. After Mom died, that habit followed me into the estate situation. Part of me felt guilty, even questioning Vivian. She was grieving too, and I kept wondering whether I was being petty over a house. Maybe she really had misunderstood something. Maybe I was reading too much into the document because I was already hurt by what she'd said. But the numbers wouldn't leave me alone. I spread the estate papers across my kitchen table and started comparing them with the document Vivian had given me. I checked dates, figures, property expenses, and the amounts connected to Mom's finances. Then I noticed another detail that didn't match what Vivian had been telling everyone. It wasn't huge. Someone who wasn't used to reading financial documents might have missed it completely. But I wasn't someone who would miss it. I went back through the papers twice, then a third time. The more I looked, the harder it became to believe Vivian had simply made an innocent mistake. That was the first night I stopped asking myself whether Vivian meant well. Because bookkeeping was my work, I had learned never to trust a number simply because someone said it confidently. Numbers left trails. They showed where money had gone, when something had changed, and sometimes what people preferred not to explain. So I started with the estate correspondence. I pulled out the property records, old tax statements, receipts for repairs, and the documents showing expenses Mom had paid over the years. I wasn't looking for proof that Vivian had lied. At least, that's what I told myself. But the more I compared everything, the stranger it became. Vivian had been talking about the house as though Mom had already promised it to her. She spoke about renovations, selling it, even choosing which rooms she would change. The legal documents didn't say that. Then, I found something I hadn't expected. There were records showing that Vivian had received financial help from Mom before she died, and some of that money was connected to the same estate. Vivian had never mentioned it to me. As far as I knew, the family had always been told that Vivian had simply been helped when she needed it. I sat back from the table. I didn't immediately assume she'd done anything wrong. There could have been an explanation. Maybe I was missing something. Then I found a note from the estate lawyer asking for clarification about a previous transfer. That made me stop. I read the note twice. Whatever was happening with Mom's estate, it was more complicated than Vivian had made it sound. The next morning, I called the lawyer's office. I explained what I had found, and after a short pause, the lawyer said, "There are some details I can't discuss over the phone."
I understand, I said.
"But there is one document you should receive shortly. Once you have it, you'll understand why we've been waiting." I thanked her and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, wondering what could possibly be inside that document. I didn't tell Vivian what the lawyer had said. And for the first time in my life, keeping something from my sister didn't feel dishonest. The envelope arrived 3 days before Vivian's birthday. I recognized the lawyer's return address immediately, and for several seconds, I just stood there holding it. It was thick, cream-colored, and heavier than an ordinary letter. My name was printed neatly across the front, along with a reference to Mom's estate. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen counter. I didn't open it right away. I needed a few minutes to remind myself that whatever was inside, I had no obligation to react before I understood it. When I finally opened it, there were copies of finalized documents and a letter explaining how the property was legally supposed to be handled. I read slowly. The house was not automatically Vivian's. Mom had made provisions that accounted for financial assistance Vivian had previously received. There was also a specific condition that had to be satisfied before any transfer could take place. And because I had been the one managing certain estate expenses, I had a legally important role in that process. I read that paragraph twice. Then my phone buzzed. "Vivian, did the envelope come?"
I stared at the message.
A minute later, another appeared. "Please don't make this difficult." Then, before I could decide whether to answer, "I know Mom wanted me to have the house." I put the phone down. She hadn't asked whether I was okay. She hadn't asked what the lawyer had sent. She wasn't even pretending to be uncertain anymore. She knew about the envelope before I had told her. I looked at the documents spread across my table and felt something inside me settle. For years, silence had meant giving Vivian room to speak first, explain first, and decide what everyone else should believe. But this time, staying quiet gave me something different. It gave me time to think. And that was when I realized Vivian wasn't waiting for paperwork. She was waiting for me to give her permission. I called the estate lawyer the next morning and asked her to walk me through the documents slowly. I didn't want to misunderstand something and accuse Vivian of something she hadn't done. The lawyer explained that Mom had never simply left the house to Vivian. The property was meant to remain available to both of us unless one daughter chose to purchase the other's interest under specific conditions. Then she explained the part that made everything fall into place. The financial help Vivian had received from Mom wasn't simply a gift. It had been documented as an advance against her eventual inheritance. I sat quietly while the lawyer explained the numbers. Vivian's share had already been reduced by what she had received, and the house was worth considerably more than the remaining inheritance available to her. Suddenly, her confidence made sense. So, did the document she'd asked me to sign. Her plan only worked if I accepted her version of things without asking questions. If I signed away my interest, she could move forward as though the house had always belonged to her. I thanked the lawyer and hung up. For a long time, I just sat at my kitchen table. I wasn't suddenly rich. I hadn't discovered some secret fortune with my name on it. What I had discovered was something much more important to me. Vivian had never been entitled to treat me like an obstacle in a deal that was never hers to control. And Mom hadn't forgotten me. That realization brought an unexpected kind of relief. I thought about every time Vivian had spoken as though the decision had already been made, every time I'd questioned myself, and every time I'd wondered whether I was being difficult simply because I wanted to understand. Now I knew why she had been pushing so hard. The question was what I would do with the truth. I could have mailed the documents. I could have asked the lawyer to handle everything. Instead, I put the envelope in my purse and went to her birthday. The morning of Vivian's birthday, I seriously considered staying home. I knew what the evening would look like. Vivian would have everyone around her, laughing and telling her how successful she was, and I would probably spend half the night wondering when someone was going to ask me what I was doing with my life. Still, I realized that if I stayed home, I would only be confirming what my family had always assumed about me. That when Vivian pushed, I backed away. So I went. I kept the cream envelope inside my purse and drove to the party without deciding exactly what I would say. I wasn't going there for revenge. I wasn't trying to embarrass Vivian. I just wanted her to hear the truth directly from me for once. When I arrived, she acted as though nothing had happened between us. She gave me a small, almost patronizing hug and smiled for everyone watching. Later, when we were briefly alone near the hallway, she lowered her voice. "You brought it, didn't you?" I looked at her. Yes. Her shoulders relaxed, and she smiled.
Good.
Then maybe we can finally move forward. I said nothing. She walked back toward the dining room, and I stayed where I was for another moment, feeling the envelope against the side of my purse. She thought she knew what was inside. She thought I had brought it because I had finally accepted her version of the story. She had no idea. And then Vivian decided to make sure everyone in that room understood exactly what she thought of me. By the time dinner was served, I could feel the evening slipping into the kind of family gathering I'd learned to survive by staying quiet. Vivian was talking about her career, the projects she was involved in, and the plans she had for the house. Everyone listened. They always did when Vivian spoke with confidence. At one point, Uncle David asked me, "So, Elise, what have you been doing lately?" I opened my mouth, but Vivian answered first. She still works from her kitchen table. A few people laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter, exactly, but it was enough to make me feel small. Vivian smiled and lifted her glass. "That's Elise. She's always been happy keeping things simple." I looked down at my plate. Then she went further. "You know, I honestly don't understand why she never tried for more." Nobody answered. Vivian leaned back in her chair. "Honestly, Elise, you've always been the family failure. Mom just didn't have the heart to say it." The room went completely quiet. For a second, I felt that familiar heat rise into my face. It was the same feeling I'd had as a child when Vivian said something cutting, and everyone waited to see whether I would make a scene. I wanted to leave. I actually reached for my purse. Then I remembered the envelope. My hand closed around it, and something inside me became very still. I didn't need to defend my entire life at that table. I didn't need to convince anyone that my work mattered. I only needed to stop letting Vivian decide what everyone was allowed to believe. I pulled out the cream envelope and placed it in front of her. "Here," I said quietly. "You've been waiting for this." Vivian's expression changed for just a second. Then she reached for it almost confidently.
She opened the envelope.
She pulled out the first page. Her eyes moved across the top and then stopped. She read the first paragraph again. The confidence disappeared from her face. I watched her continue down the page. Her eyes moved lower, then back up. And for the first time that night, Vivian looked at me without knowing what to say. Vivian read the pages again, slower this time. The first document explained the estate arrangement clearly. The house had been accounted for jointly under Mom's estate, not transferred outright to Vivian. The financial assistance Vivian had received was recorded as an advance against her inheritance, and her eventual share had already been adjusted because of it. I watched her finger stop on one paragraph. "So this means," she began. "It means you couldn't simply take the house," I said. She looked up sharply. "I was told Mom wanted me to have it." "I know. And you knew this?" I knew enough to ask the lawyer. That answer seemed to irritate her more than anything else. Then she found Mom's letter. I could see Vivian's expression change as she read it. Mom had written that she never wanted one daughter's visible success to erase the other daughter's contribution. She mentioned the years I had spent helping with bills, appointments, paperwork, and the practical things that had kept her household running while Vivian was building her career. Mom didn't call Vivian selfish. She didn't criticize her career or suggest that I had sacrificed more. She simply made it clear that she had noticed what I had done. For years, I had wondered whether Mom noticed. She had. There was one sentence that stayed with me. Mom wrote that fairness did not mean pretending one child mattered more because her accomplishments were easier to see. I read it twice. It wasn't an accusation against Vivian. Mom never called her selfish or ungrateful. She simply acknowledged what I had done, even when nobody else celebrated it. Vivian kept turning the pages, searching for something that would make the documents say what she expected. I recognized that expression. I had worn it myself whenever I hoped a painful truth would somehow become different if I looked at it long enough. And the words on those pages would remain there. Vivian shook her head. These documents have to be wrong.
They aren't, I said.
I already confirmed everything with the lawyer. Around the table, questions started coming from different directions. What does this mean for the house? Was Vivian already given part of the inheritance? Why didn't we know about this? Vivian looked at me, waiting for me to explain everything, defend her, or somehow make the situation less uncomfortable. For once, I didn't. I answered only what I knew. The more questions people asked, the quieter Vivian became. Then she looked down at the papers again, and I realized she finally understood something that had nothing to do with property. The problem wasn't the envelope. The problem was that I no longer needed her permission. Vivian looked at me across the table. You knew about this before tonight. I knew the documents were coming. And you didn't tell me. I didn't hide anything from you. I just refused to sign something I didn't understand. She shook her head. You did this deliberately. You wanted to embarrass me.
No.
You've always been jealous of me. I felt the old instinct rise in me, the urge to explain myself until she finally understood. But I was tired of explaining. I wanted to know what Mom actually decided, I said. Vivian's voice tightened. Mom wanted me to have that house. Maybe you believed that. I know she did. I looked at her. Wanting something doesn't make it yours. She stared at me. Then she brought Mom into it. She would be so disappointed in you. That one hurt. For a moment, I felt 17 again, standing in our childhood kitchen while Mom asked me to give in just one more time. I looked down at the papers and had to take a breath before I answered. I spent years believing peace meant letting you have the last word. Vivian didn't say anything. I don't believe that anymore. The room stayed quiet. I told her I wasn't trying to take anything from her. If she wanted the house, she could work with the lawyer and follow the estate terms. We could resolve everything fairly. But I won't sign away my rights just to keep you comfortable. Aunt Carol spoke quietly from the other end of the table. I honestly thought Vivian was getting the whole property. So did I, Uncle David admitted. But Elise was the one taking care of your mother most of the time. Vivian looked around the table, almost as if she couldn't understand how quickly the room had changed. For years, everyone had accepted the same story. Vivian was the successful daughter. I was the practical one. She was going somewhere. I was simply there. Now, for the first time, people were asking whether that story had ever been fair. Vivian pushed her chair back. I need some air. She walked out of the room, leaving the documents on the table. I watched her go, but I didn't follow. The strange thing was, once I stopped trying to make Vivian understand me, I felt lighter. The estate was eventually handled the way Mom had intended, through the lawyer and the proper paperwork. Vivian couldn't simply take the house, but she still had choices. Each one required her to acknowledge the financial assistance she had received and the actual value of the property. There was no dramatic courtroom scene or family war. Just paperwork, uncomfortable conversations, and the consequences of decisions that had been avoided for too long. What changed most was the way my family treated me. One evening, Aunt Carol called me privately. I owe you an apology, she said. I believed Vivian because she sounded so certain. I never stopped to ask what you knew. I didn't know what to say at first. Thank you, I finally said. Another relative admitted they had assumed I was holding things up simply because Vivian had said I was. That hurt, but hearing it also helped. At least now I knew I hadn't imagined the pattern. Vivian never became the perfect sister after that. She didn't suddenly apologize for everything or admit that she'd been wrong about me for years. If anything, she became quieter. Our relationship remained damaged, and I accepted that some things don't return to the way they were simply because the truth comes out. I also refused to humiliate her in return. I didn't tell everyone every detail. I didn't send copies of the documents around. I didn't use what I'd learned as a weapon. I simply stopped participating in the old pattern. I kept working at my bookkeeping business. I made decisions without first wondering how Vivian would react. When I didn't want something, I said no. When I needed time to think, I took it. And slowly, those choices stopped feeling rebellious and started feeling normal. I had spent years measuring my life against Vivian's. That birthday was the first time I realized I had been using the wrong ruler. When I think about that envelope now, I realize it never made me successful. It didn't make me smarter, stronger, or more worthy. It simply gave me the evidence I needed to stop accepting someone else's version of who I was. Vivian may always believe she's the more successful sister. Maybe that's something she'll never change. But I don't feel the need to compete with her anymore. My life is quieter now. I have work I respect, relationships I choose, and peace I no longer have to negotiate for. For years, I thought keeping everyone happy was the same thing as being a good daughter and a good sister. I know better now. Sometimes keeping the peace only means you're the person doing all the sacrificing. Being underestimated can hurt. I know that better than most. But sometimes it also teaches you to build a life that doesn't depend on applause. I still have that cream envelope tucked away with Mom's papers. Not because I need proof anymore, but because it reminds me of the night I finally stopped asking whether my life was enough. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone you loved, or made to feel selfish for finally setting a boundary, I'd genuinely like to know. What was the moment you decided you weren't going to keep shrinking yourself anymore?